My name is Meron Langsner. I am the head curator of Clashing Steel, the Art of Stage Combat, here at Culture Lab LIC. Let's come take a look. This first section is primarily new swords and some daggers, a knife or two, and this is the work of Jesse Belsky and Louis Shaw. Louis Shaw is pretty much considered the top sword maker working today for theater. And if Louis is the king, then Jesse is the crown prince. Jesse is also our associate curator because as we were putting this together, we found that he just had knowledge of the makers who preceded them that myself and my co-curator Ed Joe Wheeler did not. So we like to give credit where it's due. And we were very blessed to have him on board and lending us not only his props, but also his knowledge. So one thing about these types of swords, because one question that came up a few times during the exhibit was, what period is this from? Now, these basically replicate the Renaissance, but I would say is this isn't really the Renaissance. These aren't a real history, these are an imagined history. So the thing with stage combat is your two biggest priorities as a fight director are safety and narrative clarity. And in order to have narrative clarity, this comes down in the choreography, and this comes on in the repeatability and giving people a simulacra of what actual swordplay would be. Because if you've ever seen Olympic fencing, and I speak as a former competitive fencer, it's too fast and too subtle to really be a spectator sport, unfortunately. But if you watch theatrical fencing, it's exciting and clear and has a narrative. So as we walk through here, you can see details of the workmanship, and you can see that these are works of art in and of themselves. One of the things that gave me the idea for this was that if you took the work of Jesse or Louis and you threw it in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I don't believe anyone would blink. I think they would accept it along with all the other beautiful pieces there. So moving along, we have parrying daggers, we have a really beautiful Bowie knife, we have a Viking style sword, and we're getting into the long swords, which show a different period of European fencing at this point. Getting here, we have our heavier weapons. Some of these are steel, some are aluminum. The aluminum ones weigh nothing, and I wish you could experience holding them because it's really an experience. The photos we have on exhibit are by a man named Theek Smith. Theek is the most loved stage combat photographer in New York City and is also a pretty renowned dance photographer. So Louis Shaw, who I've mentioned a few times, is here in this middle photo. We have several things. I want to thank Rob Hunter at Preferred Arms. Preferred Arms is the largest theatrical weapon rental company in the country. And one thing that Rob Hunter told us about this section, I've been colloquially calling this the Smashy Bashy section. The difference between the stage version and what would be a real version is almost nothing. Like, that is still a heavy steel hammer. That you would be using stage technique in order to keep your actors safe and to have clean technique and clean narrative. And I say safety again because that's the most important aspect of this skill set. These pair of kukri are from, they're the weapons of the Gurkhas, who are basically soldiers that the British Empire used out of I believe Nepal. And they are less often seen on stage. They narratively would give a character a different flavor because people don't necessarily recognize them. They're kind of a giant knife that works like an axe, is how I would describe it. And these are made by Nate Deku, who is a fight choreographer currently based out of Michigan, who makes everything out of aircraft aluminum. So really cool stuff, really light. Here we deconstructed a sword to give ideas of what the pieces are. And as we come into this room is one of my favorite things that I was trying to make happen in this display. So here we have two different executions of two different shows. We're going to start with the back wall, where we have a contemporary and traditional Romeo and Juliet. So we'll start with the traditional one. So if you know Romeo and Juliet, you can look at this and you can say, okay, at the end of the play, when Juliet kills herself with a dagger, you can look at this and know exactly which dagger this is. One thing about Romeo and Juliet specifically that not everyone knows is the play was written in response partially to the publication of the first Italian fencing master publishing in English. And much of what Mercutio says about Tybalt is making fun of that manual. So he talks about a villain who fights by the book of arithmetic, a gentleman of the first house, the passado, the punto reverso, etc. So you can look at this and say, who's the person obsessed with fencing? And you can also know that, that you only need two swords to do this play, because Tybalt fights Benvolio, Tybalt fights Mercutio, Tybalt fights Romeo. Romeo can pick up Mercutio's sword when that happens, and then Romeo fights Paris in the tomb. And those are pretty much all of your scripted fights. When we look at the contemporary Romeo and Juliet, where they're all using balisong knives, so those knives kind of are a blade held by two handles, and those are all training versions of those. You can see that character choices could be made about who holds what knife. And of course, we have the crowbar for the scene in the tomb that ends up becoming a weapon. These other two shows that we have up are two iterations of She Kills Monsters, which I believe we have scripts of over here for people to see. So She Kills Monsters is written by a man named Qui Gwen. If you're familiar with Disney's Raya, that's the same writer. So he wrote this play in the early 2010s and set it in a world that is mostly Dungeons and Dragons. So it became very popular. It was one of Sam French's most done plays in the country, and then became popular with educational venues, which meant he did another script with all the curses taken out, and we have a kid's version of the weaponry that's all in foam and plastic. And you can look at both of these iterations. This whole room is also courtesy of Preferred Arms, Rob Hunter. And he puts these together because it's a very commonly done play, so he can rent these out as packages. And you can look at these both and know which character is using which weapon, especially if you know the play, but even not knowing the play, you could see that there's a one-to-one relationship. Like if I ask you, which is the magical hero's sword, you could pick it out. If I can ask you which is the demon queen's axe, clearly. So it's one of the pieces I'm pretty proud of. As we move back into the main hall, we have 3 aluminum blades in different stages of construction, courtesy of Jesse Belsky. So we wanted to have these out here so that people could see the process and see how these are made. Here we have 7 different small swords made by 6 different makers. So this is interesting because this particular type of sword, this was essentially the last stage of European fencing, not counting sport. And these were effectively needles with hilts. And if you're familiar with the sport of foil fencing was created to train for these. There's also a really beautiful display of historical versions at the Metropolitan Museum, so if any of these look familiar, that's why. Here, so Culture Labs Gala was Camelot, so we had a sword in the stone. So we have beautiful stone made by Zoe Morset and a long sword by Baltimore Knife and Steel. So you can have a look at how these look in action. So we have these mostly grouped by who lent them to us. So these are all on loan from J. David Brimmer, who's a top fight director, has done many Broadway shows with many of the top people in this industry. You don't know their names, but you've seen their work. So one of these was used by Patrick Stewart in a Broadway production. The knife was used in An Octoroon, which was a very important play by Brandon Jacob Jenkins that happened fairly recently. And then the longsword over here is created by a man named Oskar Kolumbovich, who was extremely active in the 1970s. And we have a catalog on loan from him and some other pieces by him. Here, from Preferred Arms, we have a Peter Pan set, and you can look at these and know which is a good guy's weapon, which is a bad guy's weapon, which sword is Peter Pan's, which sword is Captain Hook's. And we have, I jokingly refer to these as our utility and dress hooks. I'm standing next to a mace on loan from J. Allen Suddath. So this one we really love, and we put a magnifying glass next to it, so this makes an appearance in the man's book. And every show it's been in has been etched into the handle, or etched into the stem, as it were. So that's, and you can see, looking at it, how much wear and tear this thing has been through. So moving on, we have just a variety of unusual blades on loan from Arms and Armor. Some of these date back quite a while, some are relatively new. And one thing about these items is that you're making a dramaturgical choice when you give these to a character. So if you're deciding who's using what and when and for what purpose, having a catalog can make quite a difference. I have some more training photos by Thiek Smith. So these are mostly taken at an event called the Summer Sling, which is a big, basically workshop done in New York City every summer. That's 4 days, 4 classes per day, all by different teachers. Here, underneath this glass, we have a catalog from the 1970s by Oskar Kolumbovich. And price list, letters, the price list is quite something, especially if you compare it to the items that we have for sale here. So the idea of anything like this for under $100 is kind of shocking. These are on loan from Jared Kirby. Jared Kirby's a working stuntman, teacher, actor. He runs New York Stage and Screen Combat. What's interesting with the stuff we have from Jared is that he is also a big proponent of historical European martial arts. So he mixes that in with the way he teaches. Also, what's interesting along this wall is this is a fencing saber handle with an epee blade. And this is, we often refer to these as single sword, and these are what's used most commonly in training. The brass knuckles are one of my favorite things in this show. So these were found by J. Allen Suddath late one night many years ago in downtown New York City. He found them under a dumpster. We pretty much believe that they were used for something nefarious, and they have since been in Newsies on Broadway. So the life of something, and also a commentary on what is and is not real. Here again, this is Nate Decoux. This is a giant aluminum scalpel. I used this in a play called Callie many years ago, and it was in a pretty much horrific nightmare sequence. Moving along this wall, we have different rapiers and small swords. These are all from J. Allen Suddath's collection, so different makers, different time periods, and all just beautiful examples of form. All of this, the rest of this is J. Allen Suddath. So this piece is, I find extremely interesting. It's a hunk of metal with some brass bolted to it. And this is heavy and unwieldy and up for historical interest to show how far we've come. The longbow has a radio transmitter that would trigger a sound cue. So that's very fun. And the shields that we have up, so we see one from the front, one from the back. Those were used in a production of the Henriade and were used by Joan of Arc. And when you meet her, her shield is basically clean and unblemished. And when you meet her again in battle, she's got the very beat up shield. So we have the physical storytelling. And then we have a glaive up here that he used in a production of Macbeth, where his Macbeth is a very large man, and he needed a weapon that would not look like a toy in his hands. I want to end with these beautiful pieces. These are by Zoe Morset. Zoe Morissette is a prop designer with many Broadway credits, including Hamilton. So that breastplate is something she got on loan from a company that's up in New England. It looks like bronze, it is foam and weighs nothing. The helmet is in progress, and we have that up as just an example of what much like the aluminum blades, what the work looks like. So yeah, so that's our exhibit in brief, and thank you for joining me on this adventure.